He watched America burn, and no one noticed. Chapter 1. The Soil Beneath the Empire. The year had not yet found its name. The sun rose over a land still raw, the forests cut open like wounds, the rivers swollen with the runoff of progress. Beneath the trees, the air held the scent of sap and smoke, and in that mingled perfume lay the history of a continent being unmade and remade by foreign hands. The observer walked through this new America, though he did not call it home. He had no name, no title, only the eyes that beheld and the mind that refused to look away. He had arrived in a colony that promised freedom to those who had never known it, yet the soil itself was heavy with chains. The fields stretched wide, planted by those who owned nothing, watched over by those who owned everything. The observer felt the distance between these two worlds not as a line, but as a wound, open and bleeding through time. He moved through the markets and the taverns, through the sermons and the punishments, through the laughter that always sounded too forced, the hymns sung too loud to hide the fear beneath them. The men who ruled spoke of providence and destiny, of divine right and civilization, but their hands trembled with greed. They carved their names into ledgers and land deeds, marking their triumph in ink that would never fade. Beneath those marks, unseen, lay the crushed signatures of others, the ones who labored, who harvested, who built, who died unnamed. The observer saw their shadows moving through the fields at dawn, stooping and rising in rhythm with the sun, their bodies the machinery of an empire that pretended to be born of liberty. He watched as the towns grew, their spires and courthouses rising like monuments to righteousness. The wooden walls smelled of fresh-cut pine and hypocrisy. He walked among them unseen, hearing the creak of every floorboard, the whisper of every secret. He saw the preachers thundering against sin, while the slave ships moored quietly behind their churches. He saw merchants counting profits earned from suffering that they refused to name. And everywhere he saw faces, faces of every color, every creed, bound together not by freedom, but by fear. The streets were filled with voices proclaiming the dawn of a new world. Yet the observer saw the old world reflected in every surface, the same hunger, the same cruelty, the same hierarchy, only wrapped now in the language of progress. Even the soil seemed to know it, trembling underfoot as if burdened by what was buried within it. The fields were not only for harvest, they were graves of ambition and despair. The observer felt each step as an intrusion, each breath as borrowed air. He walked to the edge of the plantations, where the forests began again, where the empire's reach faltered and the wilderness reclaimed its due. There he found silence, not peace, but the silence of exhaustion. The trees seemed older than time, indifferent to the flags and prayers of men. They whispered nothing, yet their stillness spoke of endurance. The observer lingered there, feeling the distance between himself and the world he chronicled. He was not a participant, only a witness, yet he carried the weight of every injustice as though it were his own. When night came, the horizon burned. The fires of the foundries, the torches of the overseers, the glow of ambition, it all merged into a single fevered light. The observer thought of how men mistake that glow for progress, how they forget that light can blind as well as guide. Beneath that light, the cities expanded, the fields deepened, and the distance between freedom and bondage widened until it became the very foundation of the land. The observer wondered if a nation could be born from such contradictions, or if it was already dying in its cradle. He wrote nothing, yet his memory was precise. Every lash that cut the air, every sermon that justified cruelty, every handshake that sealed corruption, all were preserved within him. He knew that centuries later, others would walk these same streets, breathe this same air, and still feel the weight of those unspoken truths. The faces would change, the flags would change, but the soil would remember. And so the observer continued through the night, past the wharves and the fields, past the laughter of the powerful and the silence of the broken. He did not seek justice nor redemption, for he no longer believed in either. He sought only understanding, the kind that burns, the kind that refuses to fade. In the stillness before dawn, he realized that the new world was not new at all. It was merely another mask worn by the old, another empire draped in the language of hope. The observer moved on, leaving behind the lights and the songs, the sermons and the whips. The forest swallowed him again, and the land resumed its endless labor. Somewhere a bell rang for morning, calling the free and the unfree alike to another day of toil. The observer listened until the sound dissolved into the wind. He knew the echo would never end. Chapter 2: The Machinery of Heaven. The dawn came heavy, its light not a blessing, but a reckoning. The fields shimmered with dew that resembled sweat, each drop reflecting the labor of the unseen. The observer emerged from the forest, his shoes caked in the mud of a land that would not forget its own making. The plantations sprawled before him like kingdoms without crowns, their masters asleep beneath imported linen, their workers already bent to the soil. He felt the air thicken with the rhythm of work, that silent metronome of empire. The machinery of the colony was invisible to those who benefited from it. It existed not in the gears of iron, but in the bones of men. The overseer's whip cracked not only across flesh, but across time, sending echoes that would reach far beyond this century. The observer sensed that this violence was not merely physical, it was spiritual, systemic, a doctrine dressed as duty. Every lash was a sermon, every chain a scripture. The churches stood in the heart of the settlements, their bells tolling promises of salvation. Inside, the sermons rose and fell with the same cadence as the windmills on the outskirts. Salvation had become a business, the spirit a commodity. The observer watched as the rich knelt piously, their hands polished with the same oil that greased the ships carrying slaves and sugar. They prayed for mercy, yet none for those who made their wealth possible. Faith here was not a refuge, but a mask. The more fervent the prayer, the deeper the hypocrisy it concealed. He wandered to the shipyards, where craftsmen shaped the skeletons of vessels that would cross the ocean to fetch profit and pain in equal measure. The air smelled of pitch and brine. Boys, barely grown, wielded tools too large for their hands, and their songs, wordless, rhythmic, rose with the sound of saws. The observer watched the timber transformed into hulls strong enough to carry despair across the Atlantic. The ships gleamed in the morning light, beautiful in their precision, monstrous in their purpose. Each plank bore the fingerprints of men who would never board them as passengers. The observer noticed that the town's architecture had begun to change. Brick replaced wood. Iron replaced rope. Permanence was being built atop transience. The colony was no longer a frontier. It was a machine, self-replicating, self-justifying. Its gears turned through the exploitation of bodies, its pistons fueled by faith and fear. The observer thought of the paradox that powered it all. Men spoke endlessly of liberty, even as they tightened the bonds of others. He saw in their words the seed of every contradiction that would define the centuries to come. The nights grew longer. Smoke from the furnaces dimmed the stars, and the air tasted of iron. The observer walked past forges where men hammered raw metal into chains and rifles. The rhythm of their labor sounded like a heartbeat, steady and inescapable. Progress, they called it. But progress was a pyre that consumed without discrimination. The observer saw children born beneath its glow, their first breaths filled with ash. He saw the poor trading hunger for survival, the rich trading morality for comfort. The colony no longer resembled the dream that birthed it. It resembled its own reflection, distorted and unrepentant. At the edge of the settlement, he found a quarry where convicts broke stone from dawn to dusk. Their faces were hidden by dust, their movements mechanical. Above them, a single flag fluttered in the heat, its colors bright against the gray. It promised unity, but the observer saw only division. He realized that nations do not form from ideals, they form from the enforcement of order. Freedom was a currency, hoarded by the powerful, rationed to the obedient. When rain finally came, it did not cleanse. It fell like penance, heavy and cold, soaking into the same soil that drank the blood of the enslaved. The observer stood unmoving, feeling it run down his face. Around him, the colony continued its rhythm, bells ringing, hammers striking, sermons echoing. The rain changed nothing. It only made the colors of injustice sharper, the outlines clearer. By nightfall, the streets glistened, reflecting torchlight like veins of molten gold. The observer walked them silently, tracing the patterns of expansion and decay. He saw how each new building, each new law, each new proclamation carried within it the same seed of hierarchy that had haunted the old world. The colony's citizens believed they were shaping a republic of virtue. In truth, they were erecting a mirror that would one day show them everything they had refused to see. In that reflection, the observer glimpsed not only their fate, but his own. He realized that history was not written by the victors, but by the witnesses, the ones who refused to look away. And so he continued walking, his silence the only rebellion left in a world that mistook noise for progress. Chapter 3: The Kingdom of Smoke. The river was a vein of fire beneath the morning mist. Ships moved like slow beasts across its surface, their sails pale and skeletal against the rising sun. The observer followed its current toward the city that had grown like a cancer from the river's mouth, a labyrinth of markets and furnaces where smoke replaced clouds and coin replaced faith. It was here, among the chimneys and whispers, that the promise of the new world began to rot. The city did not sleep. It merely shifted its breathing. The streets were narrow, choked with the runoff of ambition, mud, refuse, and the restless murmurs of the forgotten. He saw children with eyes too old for their faces, carrying buckets of coal heavier than their bodies. He saw the rich staring from carriages, their expressions neither cruel nor kind, merely indifferent. That indifference was the city's truest currency. It passed from hand to hand more easily than silver. The factories rose like cathedrals, their chimneys sanctifying the air with soot. Inside, the sound of labor was ceaseless. The observer moved through the haze, invisible among the workers who toiled without pause. Their movements were synchronized like gears, each gesture another tick of the empire's clock. The masters of this place no longer needed chains. They had perfected a subtler bondage. Hunger, debt, and fear did their work without complaint. Above it all, the overseers watched from balconies of iron. They spoke of efficiency, of progress, of destiny. Yet beneath their words was the same old hunger that had driven kings and conquerors before them. The observer recognized it at once, for it was eternal. The will to own not only land and labor, but also the meaning of both. He wondered how long a nation could breathe this air before forgetting what purity ever felt like. In the taverns, men gathered to drink away the knowledge of their complicity. Their laughter was loud, their gestures theatrical, but beneath it all lay a weariness too deep for words. They boasted of liberty, even as they feared the next tax, the next war, the next collapse. The observer saw that they had inherited not freedom, but anxiety, the endless vigilance of those who must guard their illusions. The city had given them everything but peace. The river carried ships toward the ocean, laden with tobacco, rum, and iron. The observer stood at the docks and watched them vanish into the horizon, each one a vessel of extraction. The goods they carried were not merely commodities, they were fragments of human life. Every barrel of sugar was a season of pain. Every crate of cotton a decade of servitude. The wealth of the city was measured not in gold, but in suffering, refined to silence. Night descended early, drawn down by the smoke. The lamps flickered in the streets, casting halos over the filth. The observer walked through the alleys where the poor slept in doorways, wrapped in rags that once belonged to others. Their dreams were feverish, their breaths shallow. He wondered if they ever dreamed of freedom, or if freedom had become too abstract a word to summon in sleep. In the square, a gallows stood unused, yet never forgotten. It loomed as both threat and monument, a reminder that justice here was ornamental, reserved for those who could afford it. The observer felt the crowd's gaze when he passed. It was not suspicion, but resignation. They had ceased to look for saviors. They had learned to worship endurance instead. The colony's gods had evolved from divine figures to faceless systems, and the people prayed now not for mercy, but for stability. The observer climbed to the city's highest hill, where the mansions of the elite glittered through the haze. From there, the river looked like a wound cutting through the land. The smoke below rose in perfect rhythm with the heartbeat of progress, pulsing with life stolen from others. The observer understood then that this was not merely a city, it was a prophecy. What began here, beneath the banners of prosperity and divine purpose, would echo across centuries. When morning came again, the smoke had thickened to fog. The ships still moved, the factories still roared, the overseers still counted. Nothing had changed, and that constancy was the most damning truth of all. The observer turned away from the river, his lungs filled with the residue of empire. He walked into the haze, knowing that the kingdom of smoke would outlast even those who built it, for its true foundation was not in stone or law, but in the quiet acceptance of the masses who had forgotten that they were many. Chapter 4. The Harvest of Ashes. The fields lay beneath a pale sun, their stalks brittle, the soil restless with memory. The observer had returned to the countryside, drawn by the rhythm of the harvest. It was a season both sacred and cruel, a time when the earth yielded its gifts only to remind men of their dependence. The plantations stretched into the horizon, a geometry of control. Every furrow was a scar, every row a record of ownership. The land bore the shape of those who claimed to own it. The workers moved in silence, their bodies bent like the grain they gathered, faces hidden beneath straw hats darkened by sweat. The overseers rode among them, their shadows long and sharp, their gazes steady. Whips were no longer raised often, they no longer needed to be. The system had refined itself into obedience. Hunger and habit did what once violence had to enforce. The observer saw in this efficiency the perfection of cruelty, the kind that no longer required spectacle. He watched the granaries fill, each sack marked with the crest of a family whose name would one day be engraved in marble. The wealth accumulated quietly, without sound or guilt. In the manor houses, books were written about liberty and reason, while servants polished the silver. The masters believed themselves enlightened, their cruelty hidden beneath discourse. They spoke of progress as though it were virtue, and the observer realized that moral language had become their camouflage. Beyond the estates, the towns prepared for celebration. Banners unfurled, bells rang, and speeches were composed to praise the abundance of the season. The observer stood at the edge of the crowd, unseen, while the governor declared prosperity a sign of divine favor. The people cheered, though few had eaten well. The harvest belonged to the powerful, but its illusion belonged to all. Gratitude was the only affordable luxury. As night fell, fires were lit across the fields, burning away the chaff. The flames moved like restless spirits, devouring what could not be sold. The observer watched as the smoke rose toward the indifferent stars. He thought of the years ahead, of other harvests, other fires, and the slow accumulation of ash that would one day bury this land. The soil would grow heavy again, not with crops, but with the residue of endless consumption. He walked through the remnants of the burned fields, his boots sinking into the soft ash. It clung to his skin, filled his lungs, became part of him. In the distance, the sound of laughter drifted from the manor house. Music played, toasting to a future that already smelled of decay. The observer realized that this was the cycle's truest cruelty. The same hands that harvested life would also reap its destruction, again and again, until the land itself refused to yield. The next morning, the horizon shimmered with heat. The fires had passed, leaving behind a landscape of ghosts. Workers began again, as though nothing had changed. The overseers' voices carried across the fields, rhythmic, relentless. The observer saw that the ash had already begun to settle into the furrows, becoming part of the soil, feeding the next generation of crops, the next generation of exploitation. The land was learning to sustain its own corruption. In the towns, pamphlets were printed celebrating the colony's success. Words like prosperity, order, and destiny filled their pages. He studied them and saw how language itself had become a plantation. Every word harvested, processed, and sold until it lost all meaning. Freedom, once wild, now served the same masters as the soil. He realized that the truest slavery was not of body, but of thought. At dusk, he stood by the river again, the water reflecting the orange haze of another burning field. He could not tell where the smoke ended and the sky began. The world seemed to dissolve into its own residue. He wondered whether the future would recognize these flames for what they were, not mere harvest fires, but the first sparks of a history still burning. The observer turned away, walking toward the hills where no banners flew and no sermons echoed. Behind him, the fields glowed faintly in the twilight, breathing smoke into the lungs of the nation. The harvest was complete. The ash had been gathered, and the empire, satisfied with its yield, slept without remorse. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. The air grew thinner as the seasons turned. The observer felt the weight of his own silence deepen with every passing dawn. The world he had studied so long now seemed to study him in return. Fields, cities, ships, and smoke all stared back as though waiting for him to admit that he was no different from the forces he condemned. He walked among the ruins of progress, his reflection fractured in every puddle, every shard of glass left behind by expansion. Somewhere along the way, he had ceased to exist as a man. He had become an echo. He began to move slower, not from age, but from awareness. The rhythm of labor, of trade, of prayer no longer astonished him. It merely persisted. The same prayers that once pleaded for deliverance now served as lullabies to a guilty conscience. He could no longer tell if he was recording history or being absorbed into it. The lines between witness and participant blurred until they dissolved completely. Each act of cruelty he saw left no new wound, only a faint recognition of something familiar. He realized that to watch endlessly is to be complicit. The eyes that behold suffering without intervention are tools of its endurance. The observer's greatest illusion had been that detachment could protect him, but detachment had only turned him into the perfect mirror of empire, reflecting all, altering nothing. He carried the same hunger as those he despised, the hunger to understand what should not be understood, to find meaning where perhaps none existed. Nights grew longer, and his dreams were filled with faces without names. They stared at him not with accusation, but with exhaustion. He began to hear voices not from the living, but from the soil itself. They spoke in rhythms older than language, reminding him that memory is never silent. It only waits. The forests he once found serene now seemed to whisper of things buried deeper than bones, the thoughts of the forgotten, fermenting beneath roots and rock. The observer sought solitude, but found none. Every landscape carried traces of labor, of conquest, of hope corrupted. Even the rivers seemed man-made now, their currents dictated by trade and greed. He wandered to the mountains, hoping altitude might cleanse him, yet even there smoke reached the peaks. He understood then that there was no place left untouched. The empire had conquered not only land, but perception. The air itself bore the scent of ownership. In that realization, something within him began to erode. The conviction that had once fueled his watching turned to dust. He saw that his purpose had never been to change the world, only to confirm its inevitability. The cycle of oppression, the machinery of civilization, it did not require belief to endure. It thrived precisely because it no longer shocked anyone. The observer, once horrified, now merely acknowledged. And in that acknowledgment lay the death of outrage. He wandered into the ruins of a town abandoned after fire. Charred beams and melted iron framed the skeleton of human ambition. Among the debris he found fragments of a mirror, blackened by soot. When he looked into it, he did not see his own reflection, but the reflection of everything he had seen: the overseer, the worker, the preacher, the merchant. His face was all of them, and none. He dropped the mirror, but it did not shatter. It simply sank into the ash, disappearing like memory into history. The days that followed were without distinction. Time no longer flowed, but pooled. He forgot the names of places, the count of years. Only the patterns remained: the sound of hammers, the rhythm of harvests, the cries that rose and faded like the tides. He walked until he no longer recognized his own footsteps. He wondered if he had ever truly existed, or if he had been born from the same delusion that made men believe they could own a continent. At last he came to the edge of a vast plain where nothing grew. The horizon was empty, save for a single withered tree. He stood beneath it as dusk fell, and for the first time he felt no impulse to record, to remember, to resist. The silence was complete, and within it he found the faint outline of peace, a peace that came not from understanding, but from surrender. The observer closed his eyes, and the world continued without him. Yet somewhere in the distance the sound of industry began again. A hammer struck iron, a bell rang. The empire breathed, the cycle endured. The silent witness had vanished, but his absence changed nothing. Chapter 6: The Echo of Tomorrow. The world had grown quieter. The fires that once devoured the horizon had burned themselves to embers, and the air lay heavy with the memory of smoke. Where cities once roared, now only the faint hum of wind remained, moving through the shells of what had been ambition. The observer was gone, or perhaps merely dispersed, his consciousness scattered into the landscapes he had walked. The land remembered him not as a man, but as a residue, another trace within the sediment of history. The rivers still flowed, though slower now, as if tired of carrying the weight of human consequence. The fields still yielded grain, but their abundance no longer tasted of victory. Even the sky seemed altered, its blue dimmed by centuries of dust and industry. The silence that once was rare was now the natural state of things. The colonies had grown into nations, the nations into powers, and the powers into ghosts of their own ideals. The new world had become indistinguishable from the old. Yet within that stillness something stirred, a hum beneath the soil, faint but persistent. It was the sound of memory refusing to die. The patterns remained, the hunger for dominion, the language of freedom spoken in the accents of control, the worship of progress built upon invisible suffering. These were the constants of civilization, dressed in new garments each century, renamed but never repented. The echo of the observer's gaze lingered, carried through time by those who could still feel the dissonance between what was promised and what was real. In the cities of the future, towers rose where gallows once stood. The overseers had become financiers, the plantations, factories, the sermons, manifestos. Chains turned to contracts, whips to policies, and still the rhythm persisted. The endless conversion of lives into labor, of labor into wealth, of wealth into silence. The soil beneath these cities remained restless, its roots tangled with unmarked graves. The streets gleamed, but beneath their stones lay bones that no monument would ever honor. The people walked faster now. They carried their own chains, woven of convenience and necessity, and called them freedom. They spoke of equality while building walls higher than any castle of the old world. Their machines reached the heavens, but their empathy did not. The observer, if he still existed in some spectral form, might have wept, but tears were no longer his language. He had become what the age demanded, a presence without protest, a consciousness without flesh, a memory without voice. And yet, somewhere, the land still whispered. In the cracks of sidewalks, in the rust of old railways, in the wind that swept across forgotten battlefields. It whispered of the first ships, the first cries, the first seeds planted in hope and harvested in blood. It whispered of the cost of progress, the price of forgetting. The sound was faint, but those who listened could still hear it, a reminder that history is not past but present, looping endlessly beneath the illusion of change. The mountains endured, the rivers remembered, the soil kept its secrets, and beneath every monument to freedom, the buried truth continued to breathe. The observer's absence had become a kind of omnipresence. His silence stretched across centuries, his witnessing absorbed into the conscience of the earth itself. In the dusk of a distant age, as lights blinked across a continent that once called itself new, the echo rose again. It was not a voice, but a vibration, the faint tremor of accountability returning to the surface. The future, like the past, would learn to call it by many names: guilt, awareness, reckoning. But the land would call it by only one: memory. And so the cycle turned again, the ashes settling, the wind rising, the soil breathing. The new world slept beneath its own reflection, dreaming the same dream it had always dreamed, that tomorrow would somehow be different. But the echo of the observer lingered, eternal and invisible, reminding the living that history does not end, it only changes its disguise.
Good night. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.